Okay, good afternoon. So we're just going to make some comments about the foreign fighters issues, and then after I finish, Chris will make some comments, and we'll take any questions on that issue. Then I'll resume to the normal script, and then take any other wider questions you might have. So today I'm joined by the Minister responsible for the NZSIS and GCSB, Chris Finlayson, for the announcement of a review in relation to foreign terrorist fighters. As you're aware, today was the first meeting of the new Cabinet following the general election and the swearing in of ministers. In my new role as Minister for National Security and Intelligence, I took a paper to Cabinet which contained the terms of reference for a review of our settings around foreign fighters. The fact that the paper was considered at the first meeting of the new Cabinet underscores the importance we are placing on this issue. Today I'm announcing a targeted review of capability, capacity and legislation to ensure that our settings are adequate to respond to the evolving domestic threat posed by foreign terrorist fighters. Foreign fighters taking part in or returning from any sort of conflict zone are a concern for many countries, including New Zealand. The most immediate and latest manifestation of the issue is the rapid rise of ISIL. It is estimated that around about 3,000 foreign fighters associated with ISIL hold Western passports. They threaten to return to their countries of origin, both radicalised and with military training. Our intelligence agencies are aware of the risk and are focused on addressing it. We know that a small number of New Zealanders have travelled to engage in the fighting. We're also aware of people within New Zealand who have a desire to travel and fight for ISIL. These individuals come from a variety of backgrounds, and obviously I can't discuss them on an individual level. If we take a step back, however, there are a couple of points I would like to make. Globally, the environment has changed rapidly in the past 12 months, and this has intensified in the last 6 months. In New Zealand, we have seen a similar kind of trend, albeit from a low base. You'll be aware that officials continuously assess the threat to New Zealand from terrorism. New Zealand's environment when it comes to the threat of terrorism has traditionally been benign. However, officials have recently reassessed the national threat level and taken into account a range of domestic and international factors. On Friday, they reached their independent decision to raise New Zealand's national threat level from very low to low. This means that where previously the threat of a terrorist attack was assessed as unlikely, it is now assessed as possible but not expected. This threat level is still below our partner countries, but I would note that from time to time we see specific threats emerging that we deal with on a case-by-case basis. Although the number of New Zealanders engaged in foreign conflicts or looking to travel to an area of conflict is modest compared with the actual numbers of our partners, they are significant relevant to the size of New Zealand. And they do represent a change in the New Zealand context. In light of this changing environment, Cabinet has directed officials to review our settings in relation to how we deal with the foreign fighter threat. As a government, we have a responsibility to ensure that our settings are adequate to respond to the evolving domestic threat posed by foreign fighters. This will be a tightly focused review that will look at what we need to do quickly in order to strengthen and improve our settings. Many of our international partners have taken steps to look at the exact issue, and it's important that we examine the potential flow-on effects of other countries' laws onto us. Many of you will know that there is a separate, larger review of the intelligence agencies, their oversight and their legislation, required to begin by the middle of next year. That review, which was contained in the changes we made to strengthen the oversight of our intelligence agencies last year, is expected to take quite some time. The issue of foreign fighters is an immediate and rapidly evolving one that cannot wait to be considered as part of that wider review. Therefore, Cabinet today agreed to the terms of reference for the targeted review I'm announcing today, and which Chris will go into more detail about shortly. Without preempting the outcome of the review, it's likely to recommend that some urgent changes be made to our legislation. Should that be the case, it's my intention to try and build broad parliamentary support for such legislation, which would likely need to pass before the House rises in December. It is therefore my intention that any interim measures we take this year to address the foreign fighters issue be subject to a sunset clause so that they will expire, if not carried forward, by other statutory reviews that will follow. I have this afternoon written to all parliamentary party leaders to offer them a confidential briefing from officials on the issues that the review addresses. They are welcome to take up that offer by contacting the Office of the Chief Executive of Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Andrew Kibblewhite. The review which we are undertaking is consistent with the United Nations Security Council resolution about foreign fighters, which calls on countries to address this very issue. Political parties may take some comfort from that Security Council resolution as we move forward. I'll now hand over to Chris to go through a bit more detail of the targeted review.
Well, thank you, Prime Minister. As the Prime Minister has said, the domestic threat from foreign terrorist fighters is evolving very rapidly indeed. And one of the first things I've done as the Minister responsible both for the SIS and the GCSB is to receive operational briefings about the situation here in New Zealand. It is clear to me that potentially there are gaps in New Zealand's capability, capacity and legislation to respond to the threat that foreign terrorist fighters pose and that such gaps need to be urgently addressed. The targeted review the Prime Minister and I are announcing today will be an interim measure pending the completion of the 2015 statutory review to which the Prime Minister has referred. The targeted review will consider first whether the capacity and capabilities of the NZIS, SIS and other agencies are sufficient to undertake effective and efficient investigations of suspected and returning foreign terrorist fighters and other violent extremists. Secondly, the statutory powers available to agencies to investigate and monitor suspected and returning foreign terrorist fighters and other violent extremists. Thirdly, the statutory powers available to restrict and disrupt the ability of suspected foreign terrorist fighters to travel to conflict zones. And fourthly, whether specific criminal offences should be introduced to address the behaviour of suspected and returning foreign terrorist fighters and other violent extremists. The review will take into account the experience of other similar jurisdictions, especially Australia and the United Kingdom, and also a recent United Nations Security Council resolution relating to foreign terrorist fighters. New Zealand's respect for human rights, for individual privacy, and for our tradition of free speech will underpin this review and the development of any recommendations it makes. The review will take about 4 weeks and will be led by the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, supported by the NZSIS, GCSB and other relevant agencies. I referred to a Security Council resolution, and it's important to be very clear about what this resolution actually addressed. It was Resolution 2178, adopted unanimously by the Security Council on 24 September 2014 under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, and among other things the Security Council, quote, called upon all member states in accordance with their obligations under international law to cooperate in efforts to address the threat posed by foreign terrorist fighters, including preventing foreign terrorist fighters from crossing their borders. The Security Council also emphasised the importance of states ensuring their domestic laws and regulations are fit for purpose in relation to, quote, their nationals who travel or attempt to travel to a state other than their states of residence or nationality for the purpose of the perpetration, planning or preparation of or participation in terrorist acts or the providing or receiving of terrorist training. And I can make that resolution available to anyone who would like a copy.
Prime Minister, in layman's terms, why has the Why has the terror level gone up, the terror threat level gone up?
So the independent group that look at that, the Combined Threat Assessment Group, has looked at the domestic threats and the international effects of what's happening overseas, and decided that New Zealand has fundamentally become a more risky environment. Now, it's really worth noting that it's coming off a very low base. There's obviously a sort of benign level, if you like, then there's low, and then there's the risk that we're at the moment, so very low and then low.
So the officials have found what's happening with IS or ISIS or ISIL, what's happening with IS has made New Zealand more dangerous?
Yeah, so in principle they're saying that seeing a changing international environment, the impact of that international environment as those people seek to radicalise people in our country, and the impact that they might have is presenting a riskier environment. Now, it's worth putting in the context that we have a scale which, for instance, is the same as Australia, so negligible, very low, low, medium, high and extreme. We are low. Australia on that scale is high, but nevertheless we are moving up. So it's, as I've been saying, we wouldn't want to overstate the risk, but New Zealand is becoming riskier, and that just reflects that international environment.
Have we ever moved up to this level before, or is this the first time that we've gone?
So this is the highest we've been. We did go to low, I think, prior to the Rugby World Cup, and then came back down again. So for a long period of time we've sat at very low, but low is the highest point that we've got to.
Prime Minister, in the UK, as you'll be aware, the Cameron government has got funding and facility for what it calls a channel program, which intercepts those returning fighters who have the potential to be de-radicalised, who have been repelled by their experience. In this review, are there any kind of funding provisions or policy provisions for a similar program? So
a couple of things there. I mean, one is that you'll see the review says it will look at the capabilities and capacity actually for the agencies, particularly SIS, so that's something we can look at. Second thing is there was a period of time a few weeks ago where I had, for another reason, had a discussion with David Cameron, and he's offered us access to that sort of program and information if we thought it was useful here in New Zealand.
Right, so it is potentially within this review, or would it wait till next year?
Well, I think it's the potential for us to have a look and see whether we think that makes sense. Now, the number of foreign fighters that we have that might want to return to New Zealand is obviously much smaller, but in principle we could use the kind of techniques they're deploying over in the UK.
And the review says that it's going to look at statutory powers available to investigate and monitor suspected and returning foreign terrorist fighters. Can you expand on that? That sounds way beyond cancelling passports.
Yes, it is, and it's looking at the current legislative frameworks. Does it cover foreign terrorist fighters, prosecution of them, and that's stopping them heading off overseas, and also prosecuting them when they come back? And that is entirely in line with what the Security Council wants member countries to do.
So which agencies are you talking about there?
I'm talking about prosecution agencies, which would necessarily involve the police, but also the GCSB, the NZSIS. So prosecutions are carried out by the police, so it would be a separate function which would be undertaken by them.
So you're going to expand the abilities of the SIS to surveil these extremists?
That's one of the issues that would need to be looked at in any review.
Are you talking about possibly prosecuting people before they've done anything?
No, what the Security Council want all member states to do is to look at steps that can be taken to stop people crossing borders, and then secondly, if they do cross borders and then come back, what can be done to prosecute them, and picking up on what Gordon said, also rehabilitate them and reintegrate them into New Zealand society.
Who defines who counts as a foreign terrorist fighter, and on what basis?
Well, I mean, it will be a question of fact as to whether a person is intending to leave this jurisdiction and go to another jurisdiction for certain activities. But the definitional aspect of it is a good question, one of the issues that we need to have some clarity about. And I've taken a look at the Terrorism Suppression Act, and there is an inadequacy there, among other things, in relation to that issue.
Will you specify which conflict zones? Like, will you stop people going to certain designated areas, or how will you specify?
Well,
conflict is.
you're asking me in an impromptu way to give you the findings of a review. They are the very sorts of issues that when you're looking at the Terrorism Suppression Act, we need to have absolute clarity on, because take this hypothetical, if someone was to head off to Bosnia or something like that, would you say it has been a conflict zone? On the facts, it clearly wouldn't be in these circumstances. So you do need some clarity about what exactly would be the ingredients of any offence if you're seeking to stop people leaving the borders or prosecute them when they return.
So
But
you would
also, if
specify
you
the action, but not
look
the
at
area.
Syria, if they went to Syria to fight for a group that might be seen as backed by the United States, for instance, I mean, would they be caught up in it? Would you be able to distinguish between?
Well, again, you're asking for the very issues that the review will need to undertake. If you are to prosecute people, the law needs to be extremely clear as to the circumstances that will bring them within the law, and there will be some very careful definitional questions that will need to be addressed. Otherwise, the legislation potentially would undermine people's human rights.
Isn't that exactly what the gaps are in the Terrorism Suppression Act? Like, where are the loopholes?
Yeah, well, the real issue, as it seems to me, is on the evidence that could be adduced to support a prosecution, and there are some real questions about what the scope of that would be, and also the sorts of questions that have been raised about how exactly you would define a foreign terrorist fighter. Because there are issues that the Terrorism Suppression Act is now 13 years old, and the Security Council is reminding people that these sorts of issues need to be kept under constant review.
So you said it's difficult to prove someone's a fighter, or it's
Difficult
difficult to gather the evidence?
Difficult to prove someone's a fighter. There are also questions about the collation of evidence, and evidence that would be admissible in a court of law according to the standards that we currently have.
So there's evidence that's been collected that is in other cases that wouldn't.
Well, I mean,
stand up in
you might
court.
immediately get into questions of, is it hearsay?
Is this a case
Is it admissible for various other reasons? And what we certainly do not want to have is a situation where someone is prosecuted and then there's a 5-year case while all sorts of satellite questions are being dealt with. It's in the public interest and in the interests of the good administration of justice that the law on these subjects is crystal clear, both as to the substantive offence and also the prosecution of it and the admissibility questions that will inevitably arise.
So are you talking about expanding surveillance then to prove these people are intending?
I'm primarily looking at the moment at the adequacy of the Terrorism Suppression Act, both as to substance and also as to the way these issues could be dealt with in a New Zealand court.
Is this a case of giving up, of New Zealanders having to give up some civil liberties in order for greater protection? Is there, is there a bit of a balance?
No, what we're dealing with is a new form of offence. The Terrorism Suppression Act, which was passed in haste by the New Zealand Parliament, justifiably so, in the aftermath of 2001, is probably due for a good review, and we have to adapt to changing circumstances. There's now this new phenomenon of the foreign terrorist fighter, and we have to make sure, in accordance with our obligations under international law, and mindful also, as I said, about our human rights obligations to our citizens, to assess whether or not the law is clear, whether or not there need to be some changes made, both as to the substance of what would constitute an offence and also the means of prosecuting it.
Prime Minister, over the weekend you raised the prospect of domestic beheadings. Is that part of the reason that the terrorist threat level has gone up?
I can't go into individual sort of cases. I'm just not prepared to do that. But as I said in my remarks, from time to time there are specific threats that are raised. Now, I'm not going to say what those threats are, or what actions we take, but what I can and will say is that where there is a credible threat, then the authorities take the responsible action to deal with that.
Can you tell New Zealanders that a domestic beheading is a real threat? Because
Well, what I can say is the level of risk is rising just generally, and that's reflected in the national threat, and what I can say is from time to time, the authorities are forced to deal with specific domestic issues, and where they are dealing with those issues, they take a comprehensive and thorough response to them. But I can't go into what those threats are.
Because on Saturday you specifically yourself raised the heading, so I'm basically saying do you stand by that?
I stand by all the comments I made in the weekend.
So is there a specific domestic threat of beheading? Because you raised beheading.
I'm not going to go into what threats might or might not be there. What I can say
But you're
is
hinting
that,
at it.
well, what I can say is that you have seen a number of generally academics over the course of the last 24 to 48 hours who have essentially made the comments that a domestic threat of that nature is either not going to happen or will not happen or is out of context. And what I would say is that with greatest respect to those individuals, they don't see the same information that I see.
In comparison to other threats to human security in New Zealand, how highly would you say this ranks?
Well, there are lots of different threats that people face from time to time. What's I think disturbing about what we see in this area is just the pace of change. So 6 months, 12 months ago, this was a far less significant issue or threat than it is today. And I think that's true internationally. I think if you look at ISIS 2 years ago, it was a vastly different organisation to the one we see today.
Right, but I mean, like, how likely do you think people are to get killed by this sort of activity in New Zealand?
Well, on the national risk assessment, what it basically says is it's possible but not expected. But that doesn't mean that something wouldn't happen. It just means that it's not the same threat level that we would see with our partner countries, but relatively speaking, it's rising.
Aside from the review, as the increased threat, I know it's still compared with Australia quite low, but in Australia they have taken measures, for instance, police taking over the control of security at their parliament. Has this prompted the government to take any further steps of that sort of nature of lifting security around public buildings or?
Well, in the event that the authorities believed there was a specific threat, they would take action to deal with that specific threat. I wouldn't necessarily be in a position to outline that.
Just a point of clarity about the definitions, Mr. Finlayson, you mentioned the other violent extremists category. Are you still talking about New Zealand citizens when you refer to those people?
Well, it could be. Depends on the circumstances.
Because there was a distinction between foreign fighters and other violent extremists. I'm assuming you're still talking about the review being targeting New Zealand citizens, either the foreign fighters with ISIL. Who would be in that other violent extremists category if they are New Zealand citizens? Who are we talking about?
Or people who may want to do certain things here.
So it could be, the review could be
within
doing
the jurisdiction.
ISIL.
Within the jurisdiction.
Right.
So
So
is
it
there
could be
a-
domestic violent extremists.
Correct.
Right.
And so is the fear then that what's happening with ISIS is perhaps inflaming that potential for domestic extremism?
Correct.
Or, one of the characteristics that we're seeing, if you take a more in-depth review of what's happening with ISIS, is that they have, for want of a better term, an outreach campaign taking place. So they're running a very sophisticated campaign through social media. They are looking to prey on people who might have the potential to want to become radicalised, and they are becoming quite proficient at essentially presenting information to them. So there's no question that there are people in New Zealand who are accessing that level of information, and that runs the risk that they become more attuned to the messages that are coming out of ISIS. That is just a statement of fact.
And
So
are
would
those
you-
numbers increasing and what proof do you have of that?
Yeah, so those numbers are increasing. What we'd like to do, as I've said a little bit over the weekend, is get to a point where I outline a speech which probably will look to sort of touch on these issues and some wider issues in terms of whether New Zealand will look to respond to the international effort against ISIS, to give you a bit more clarity around those numbers, because I think it is actually useful to go out and talk to New Zealanders about that in the same way that we took the view. Historically, New Zealand hasn't actually talked about its national threat risk. That has been the case in Australia and the UK and other jurisdictions, and we took the view that it wasn't sustainable for for us long term not to talk about that when other countries do. So we'd like to get to a point where we can say to you, this is broadly a range of the number of people that are in various jurisdictions that are fighting. These are the number of people that we assess to be of quite high to medium risk, and these are the number of people that we haven't yet been able to fully assess, but for reasons that would be obvious to the agencies, there is some concern there. And I think that will give both other political parties and the New Zealand public the capacity to assess what's happening here. So underlyingly, I still think New Zealand's a very safe environment, and we're a lower threat environment than countries as close to us as Australia, but we're a more risky country than we were 12 months ago.
So when you say modest, there's a modest number of New Zealanders wanting to go and fight with ISIL. Do you know the number roughly? Is it dozens, hundreds?
Yeah, I have the advice from the agencies that indicate the number of people that they think fit within that category.
And how many is it?
Well, that's the point. I'm not in a position to give you that number today.
So you have the number, but you can't actually tell us right now.
Correct. Well, I'm not prepared to tell you that today. It's probably a better way of saying it.
So, Prime Minister, I mean, some of the things you're saying here, hinting at beheadings essentially, and talking about increased threat risk, should New Zealanders be alarmed? Because these are quite alarming things you're saying.
I think the national threat is low, and in the event that there is an individual issue or circumstance, then those issues are dealt with, and from time to time, those issues take place.
Does this review look at potentially increasing the size of SIS or GCSB or creating a new agency?
I did say there are issues of capability. We're not talking about creating a new agency, but there could be issues of capability that do need to be looked at.
So new people to add to SIS or
that kind of thing, yes.
So is it fair to say that a domestic beheading is possible but not expected?
Well, I'm not going to say that. What I'm going to say is if there is a specific threat, then I would expect the agencies to take those threats very seriously, and I would expect them to deal with them. And it's their job to do everything they can to make sure those issues are dealt with appropriately if or when they come along.
But is a domestic beheading, is it a specific threat?
Well, I'm not in a position to talk about specific threats.
But you have done it at the weekend, you talked about beheadings.
No, what I've said is that there is a context here that needs to be understood, and there will be plenty of well-meaning people and political parties that will want to imagine that there aren't risks, and unfortunately there are. And like all these things, it's a matter of assessing those risks, dealing with them, and protecting New Zealanders. And the government doesn't have the luxury that some people have of giving a view without access to the information and then walking away from the responsibility that might flow if we didn't take a course of action and something went wrong. And all I'm simply saying to you is if anyone believes that there is absolutely no risk of a form of domestic terrorism here, then they're actually deluded.
Is there a risk though of a domestic beheading?
Well, I'm not going to go into the individual threats. I'll leave you to make your own assessments.
You're still saying the risk is low, like in terms of people dying in this country, it's probably a lot more dying to poverty or work-related accidents. Do we
That's
put
right.
Paul Bennett on a watch list?
Well, no, but governments have a responsibility to adjust to different threat levels and different issues that present themselves. And there's no question on an international basis this is presenting itself as another issue. But workplace safety is something we take seriously, and last year saw the government undertaking significant reforms in that area.
So, Prime Minister, if you're not prepared to talk about the actual risk, there is this possibility of domestic beheadings, but you won't tell us what the actual risk is or exact examples. I mean, why mention it at all?
Well, because you need a bit of context around what we might be dealing with, and so that's the context that we're dealing with, that there are potentially risks. There's a higher overall national threat.
In terms of that context though, can you tell us why you're not prepared to tell us the numbers of these folks that you're talking about here, whereas in Australia, which as you say faces a higher risk, they have been prepared to do that?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and the answer is we're working our way through that with the officials. I'm pretty sure we will be able to get to a point where we give the speech later or early in November to give you a sense of the sort of overall numbers in the categories, but we're not in that position. position today.
Just looking at the problems and not wanting to preempt the review, but is there a potential for the preemptive screening statements made by those departing to be used against them on their return if there's a discrepancy? In other words, unless you have a kind of an offence like a conspiracy to go abroad to commit an offence, it seems hard to see how a preemptive screening could deter anyone set on this course unless that could be used against them on their return, any assurances that were given.
Well, you're asking excellent questions, Gordon, that go to the heart of the review and the ingredients of any offence and the admissibility of certain classes of evidence. And that's exactly why we're having the review, because we have to make sure that if anyone is prosecuted, that it's done according to law and that we're not overreaching.
Are you aware of any of these foreign fighters that have gone overseas to Syria or whatever and that have returned to New Zealand?
Yes.
So there are. Can you say how many there are?
Well, I'm not in a position to say that.
Are there any of these individuals who had their passports cancelled who have subsequently reapplied?
There's certainly people that have had passports cancelled, not necessarily the category you're talking about, but have reapplied, yes.
And have they gotten back?
Again, you're talking about an individual circumstance, it would depend. Some of them haven't. I don't know if others have. I need to check that.
I mean, does the government have enough powers to stop them if they were?
Well, that's
after
part
12 months?
that's part of the overall review.
And when are you going to establish the ISC? Will it be
Uh,
4 weeks?
Well, we obviously want to do that, but to do that fundamentally, we need a leader of the opposition, because we actually have to have a parliamentary debate to establish the ISC, and it actually names the leader of the opposition. So obviously we're not in a position to do that till Labor establish who the leader of the opposition is. So probably, it'll be as soon as we practically can, but it'll be sometime after they've actually announced the leader of the opposition. So in all probability this will go through the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, on the basis that there were legislative changes proposed. Then I think it's highly likely we'd have a Select Committee process, but a very truncated one, and it will most certainly go through the Foreign Affairs Committee.
And are we likely to see this legislation if the review is completed and it recommends law changes? Is it likely to be done by the end of the year?
That's the preference. If it came up with legislative recommendations, that they would go through by the end of the year. Now we'll have to see, subject to the capacity of the House to deal with it and all those other issues.
Just on another intelligence issue, there's new documents leaked, or a fresh batch of documents leaked by Edward Snowden, which indicate pretty strongly that New Zealand has been involved with this so-called state room program of covert signals intelligence gathering based in the diplomatic missions of Five Eyes nations, including New Zealand. Can you tell us anything about that? Is this embarrassing just in the week before the week of the vote on the UN Security Council?
We just don't comment on the activities of our GCSB and other intelligence agencies.
So will you on Monday be able to tell us the form of New Zealand's commitment to the overall coalition effort against ISIS?
Not by Monday, no.
Okay. Are you aware of the encroachment of ISIS close to the airport in Baghdad, and would this affect your decision concerning our deployment of Air Force logistical support?
Well, we're obviously constantly monitoring that, but no, I don't think it affects our P3 Orion and the commitment that we've got up there. They're actually undertaking activities in relation to piracy, and particularly Somali pirates. That this is certainly not the first rotation, so they've had a few there in the past. We'll continue to monitor that situation. As I said, at the weekend, there are a number of risks presented to people. Some are in New Zealand, and some are people that might be in a location which is highly risky, like the one you're talking about, and they're all risks that we have to consider.
Leaving aside the specific state room program, what's your view? Is it appropriate? Is it a nice thing to do to use diplomatic missions, embassies, and the like to gather intelligence on friends and trading partners?
I just wouldn't have a view I'd want to offer on that.
I read at the weekend that there was a second NSA whistleblower who was used by Glenn Greenwald for his reporting. Does that change your view on any of the comments you made about the things he's claimed about New Zealand?
No. I Okay, so we'll just move on to a couple of other little bits and pieces. And that is, look, I'd like to take a moment just to acknowledge the passing of Mark Ford. Mark made a significant contribution to this country in many ways. Particularly, I want to acknowledge his leadership in Auckland, most recently as the chair of Solid Energy. My deepest sympathies obviously go to his family. Next week we'll see the swearing in of MPs and confirmation of Speaker on Monday. On Tuesday, the state opening of Parliament will commence with the formal address and reply. Chris Bishop and Barbara Kuriga will move and second the address reply next week. Any questions on anything else? Or?
Is there cabinet next week?
Yes. Yes, there is. Yes, I've checked out. Pretty sure there is.
What do you make of David Cummins standing down?
Look, I'm sure that would have been a difficult decision for him, but I suspect he's made the right decision. I mean, in reality, it was very unlikely that he was ever going to have any chance of I think, holding on to the leadership now. In the end, being leader of the opposition is tough, and so we, pay tribute to him as a former leader of the opposition. It's not an easy role, but I suspect he's made the right call.
What discussions were had in Cabinet about measures to address child poverty in Chelmsford?
None today. It wasn't on the Cabinet agenda, and we will continue to work through that issue, and officials are continuing to work on where we might want to go there.
How well do you think the Ministry of Primary Industries is handling the gastric outbreak?
Well, look, I think that they are dealing with it as best they practically can. You wouldn't want them jumping to conclusions and either naming products, naming suppliers, or naming supermarkets when it's not exactly clear what is the particular product that is causing these tummy bugs. So I know there's lots of speculation about what it might be, but until the Ministry of Primary Industries knows exactly what the product is and who's responsible, then they need to continue to take the course of action they are.
Labor's saying that it's trying to protect the supermarket's reputation rather than looking after consumers.
No, I think that's pretty silly. Look, at the end of the day, when MPI understand exactly what's driving this, then obviously they'll do everything to make sure the product's off the shelf and to inform consumers. But you wouldn't want them going out there and saying that it's caused by a particular vegetable only to have it wrong.
How good a look is this after the Fonterra scare?
Well, I need to understand exactly what the issue is here before we make any comments. I mean, we don't know. We don't know exactly the product. We don't know what's causing it. Let's just understand that first, and then we can assess, who's responsible and why.
What odds are you giving New Zealand on the vote in the UN on Friday?
Look, I don't know whether we'll win or not, but I do know that over the course of the last 7 years, and on a bipartisan basis, we've thrown everything out that we practically can. And I feel good about the campaign we've run. I think it's been well led. I think the mission in New York's done a great job. Jim McClay's been very effective, and it's been great to have the support of David Shearer and Phil Goff and the opposition. Helen Clark, at her time as Prime Minister, established the bid and was very keen when I became Prime Minister to see me carry it on. Look, I think we'll be a great participant if we're lucky enough to get there, but you just never know with these votes, and we'll find out Friday.
Is Turkey the stronger contender given events in that region at the moment?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I saw the comments on, I think it was on Q&A in the weekend or the Nation with one of these experts saying that it was definitely going to be Spain, and look, I don't think it's that clear cut. I think the good thing about New Zealand is we have a lot of friends, and there's a lot of people that like us, and a lot of small countries see solidarity with us, and the African Union certainly has huge respect for the work that we did when we were on 93, 94. So I think we've done everything we practically can. Some countries are always going to throw around a lot more money or make promises that may or may not be able to keep. New Zealand's, I think, run a good, clean, fair campaign. We'll see whether it's enough to get us over the line.
Any news on the Obama visit?
No news, but we'll see how it goes.
I know that you've moved out of the caretaker period. Any formal approaches from the US for assistance?
No, there hasn't been any approaches.
Foreign Affairs going to release a list of who is coming to see us?
I hope so, before they turn up. They're useful for you all. But look, in the end, these things are a bit fluid. I mean, some of the leaders are having to deal with some of these domestic issues. It'll depend. If you think about the President of the United States, well, obviously it'd be great if he came, but pretty much every APEC that I've been to where the President's been coming, he's either had to cut short his visit or he hasn't made it at all. I mean, he has a horrendous schedule. He has huge international commitments, and it moves around a lot. So the reality is, these things are never firmed up till they actually turn up on the ground, in my view.
Are you a little bit more confident about the Chinese position?
Yeah, I probably would be a bit more confident there, but that's a slightly different time.
Just with Ebola, are you confident that adequate screening is taking place at our border?
Yeah, I mean, look, in terms of what's been established, we have a voluntary declaration. So people need to say whether they've been to one of the 3 countries where Ebola is most present. If they're showing any symptoms at all, they obviously need to self-declare. We've obviously established the unit in Littlemore, and we've taken a number of other steps behind the scenes. So we are a pretty low risk environment. The probability of people coming here that have been in contact with either someone that's had Ebola or been to one of the 3 countries where it's most prevalent is quite low. If that situation changes, we can always respond to that. But I think we've set ourselves in about the right place at the moment.
We've been told that a woman came in from the Republic of Congo and wasn't screened.
Well, they have to declare where they've been, or at least need to say where they've been in recent times. So it's not a matter of screening per se, it's a matter of, as I understand it, declaration of where the individual's travelled to. If they mislead the authorities on their form, then that is a breach of the requirements of their entry. But there's no specific screening of an individual, as I understand it. It's a self-declaration.
How hard is it to take somebody's temperature as they come past?
Well, it depends on your technology, but that's not the way we're doing things at the moment. When we had bird flu, you saw countries doing exactly what you're talking about, and I think that some other countries around the world, they are starting to look at those temperature devices which don't require contact, but that's not actually what's happening at the New Zealand borders. So it's not a question of us taking their temperature or not, it's a matter of them declaring whether they've been in contact.
She said she chased up with officials who gave her a pamphlet and said to report any symptoms she may notice over the next 21 days. Are you happy with that approach?
Well, I just need to understand all of the particular points, where she's been, whether she filled in the form correctly, when she came to New Zealand. But as I understand it, the form requires you to indicate whether you've been to Liberia and other countries over the course of the time before you came to New Zealand. And if you are, you need to declare that. Now, whether she did or didn't is something I don't know.
She's saying she did.
Well, then that's a matter for the authorities of how they deal with that.
Any more thoughts on sending military assistance or some kind of humanitarian assistance over to West Africa?
Too early to tell. In terms of humanitarian assistance, yeah, well, I think that there's a continued look at building humanitarian support for Ebola, and potentially financial assistance. I think they're looking for about $1 billion, as I understand. It's a substantial amount of money. We've made some contribution and may potentially make more.
When you talked at the weekend about airlift assistance, military airlift assistance, what exactly does that mean?
In principle, we have assets that can move people around and move equipment around. We obviously don't have airstrike capability. So, New Zealand, if it wants to consider what contribution it could make, could think about lots of options available to it. And the point I was really making is that people jump to conclusions very quickly and start saying that must mean the SAS and that must mean the SAS in a combat role. And my point is, while that is a possibility, I've always said that's at the real outer extreme. There's lots of other things that we could do, and it might prove that using some of our airlift capability assets is a valuable contribution to make.
So you're talking about Hercules and crew to move around troops or
Possibly.
equipment? Is that what that means?
That sort of thing, yeah. Okay.
Just try.
Might as well just handed out the fucking sheet and fucked off. Might as well have handed the sheet out and fucked off for all this.
Yeah.
That is